Nobody thought a thing like this was possible.
A pandemic that affected every single person on the planet.
Why didn't anyone stop this?
For weeks and weeks, the Chinese government kept silent.
This is the result of taking a natural virus and mucking around with it.
Hey presto, the perfect human pathogen.
That actually would make a good bioweapon.
It escaped from the lab.
They had an accident. The first cluster worked into Wuhan Institute of Virology.
They silenced journalists and disappeared some of them.
It won't stop there.
So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert it into a backbone of another virus,
right,
and do some work in the lab. So you can get more predictive when you find a sequence. You've got this diversity.
We did not fund gain-of-function research to be conducted in the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Going back to March 2019, researchers have found samples of the coronavirus in Spain, as well as in Italy in September and October, and France, Brazil, all during 2019. So it was around early on. It was what happened from the Lancet, New England Journal, Medical, UN and other institutions that set the narratives from then on. Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance was working with a number of scientists.
So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this.
With people like Ralph Barrick at UNC, we're working on such, along with Shi Zhengli at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Batwoman they call her, and another doctor from the Chulalongkorn University was also doing work within this field, as well as Danielle Anderson, the first person to cross it over into humans, was also happening. And you can see here from the sponsors, Roche, GSK, AstraZeneca, BioNTech, were all involved funding this sort of research before. It's all been revealed by Drastic Research, US Right to Know, Fleming Method, as to what happened and where all this research and funding was going into. All that has happened in the last few weeks is Anthony Fauci has redefined the gain of function and how it's done. Taiwan alerted Hubei province, who then told the WHO of an outbreak of pneumonia in several cases, and that the UN needed to alert the world. Then Joseph Malik Perez was the first person to isolate the virus in respiratory secretions of pneumonia patients in China. It was then passed on to Francis Arnold, who isolated all of the places outside of China using the Illumina protocol, which was funded by all the big people such as the Rockefeller Foundation, and she was also part of the board of Google. Here is the protocol of the isolation Illumina protocol, which is used 55-point part to do. It takes probably 2 to 3 days to isolate viruses using this protocol. So then what proceeded after that with the Lancet was they created a task force with all the same people in it. Perez, the sugar porn, Washapasori, Peter Daszak was in there, and all the big names, Danielle Anderson. So they then proceeded to put out papers in the Lancet and New England Journal and a number of places with this commission, which set the narrative. So the first case was reported on the 30th of December, the virus was isolated on the 7th of Jan, and the genomic sequence was then aligned on the 12th of January. And here it is. It then moved on. Wuhan was locked down. A global health emergency was declared by the UN. It was then named by the UN as the SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19. They set up a joint commission with China. And guess who was in the Joint Commission? Peter Daszak, as he's always in all the commissions. This then led to probably one of the most defined papers, the proximal origin, which set the narrative and said it was from nature and that anyone or anything else was conspiracy theory, and not to look into that or research into it, as it's all natural. So a number of confirmed cases started coming in slowly. A guy named Dr. Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College released a paper where he presented results of his epidemiological modelling, which informed policy making in the UK and other countries following his report in the absence of COVID-19 vaccines. So they were assessing the potential role of a number of public health measures and how they can deal with this. This kind of set the narrative for people like Tedros Adhanom, Chris Whitty, and Dr. Anthony Fauci of the NIH to then set their narratives. Meanwhile, whilst all this was going on, Moderna, if you go back to January the 11th, the Chinese authorities shared the genomic sequence. Moderna had already moved to mobilizing towards clinical manufacture of the first phase study using mRNA 1273 technology in response to the coronavirus threat. As time went on, we're talking 2 weeks after it was sequenced and isolated, the first clinical batch of the mRNA was completed, and Moderna was shipped to the first clinical batch to the NIH for their first phase clinical study. So there wasn't really much studies before they released it to be studied on people. It was just put straight into circulation at such an early stage within 2 weeks of the virus being isolated. Does that not ring alarm bells and makes you feel a bit more suspicious? The psychological and behavioural insights teams of the governments and media outlets and health experts, pushed by sort of lobbyists of the major corporations and big pharma, they've completely downplayed, censored and hid the full scale of what's been going on from day one. At the same time, they were letting thousands of Chinese, Indian and European tourists into the country and borrowing billions from the central banks to fund the job retention schemes, the business loans, the universal basic incomes, and the ministers of the governments made it look like they really cared and had society's health as number one priority, with the daily briefings and the advertisements and the jokey memes that were going around on Facebook and Twitter. But behind closed doors, they were all facilitating and giving contracts to themselves and friends, as well as the behavioural insight and psychological departments of governments were directing false information campaigns, only really strengthened the downplaying of the situation. They made false protests and still do. And what they're doing is they're keeping those who oppose the lockdowns and restrictions, you know, the more sort of awaked ones that stopped listening to the mainstream media years ago, they keep them in the controlled opposition echo chambers, away from finding out the full extent of the situation. If you've liked this episode and you want to see more, there are another 10 episodes in the COVID Debunking playlist. They're all available, and if they're not available on YouTube, they will be available on Odyssey and other platforms such as Minds.